Welcome back. For the next mini videos, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite books, The Richest Man in Babylon by George S. Clason. Now, you should already have this. It was part of the requirements for you to have the book, so if you'll open it this time, we're going to go into the very first chapter. We've already talked a little bit about it. We've talked about the foreword. The first chapter is about Ben Sear. He's a chariot builder, right? And him and his friend Kobe, they're, for lack of a better term, they're catching up on life. As we talked previously, Ben Sear was just kind of sitting there, and Kobe comes in and says, "Hey, you're pretty rich. Any man who can sit there and not work is a filthy rich man. So let's go spend your money." And Ben Sear looks at Kobe and says, "Listen, I don't even have 2 shekels. And if I had 1 shekel, that'd be my whole fortune. And I wouldn't give you any of my money because no man gives his friend his entire fortune." And so they go through and they commiserate. And to talk a few things here, he says on page 16 for me, he says, "What is the matter? Why cannot we acquire silver and gold, more than enough for food and robes?" In our world, in our country, in our nation, there are so many people who really do. They live just enough to pay for food and clothes, a car, right? When I was first married, my wife and I, we struggled. We've talked about it before in this class. Struggled in the sense we didn't have a lot of money. And we were happy with what we had. We talked about the date with the ice cream, right? But we were constantly working to make sure that we had enough to pay our bills when we were starting out. And I remember I went to a local grocery store, and I had saved my pennies, literally pennies, and nickels and dimes and dollars to pay for the food that my wife and I were going to eat. And I saw someone who had alcohol and cigarettes and junk food and all the DVDs and all things like that. And they used cash to pay for those. Then they had another pile of groceries, and they pulled out food stamps to pay for those. And I remember the anger that welled up inside of me that my taxes, here was my wife and I. We were struggling in the sense that we couldn't have everything we wanted. I couldn't buy extra DVDs or chips or snacks or ice cream because we needed the basic essentials just starting out. And here's a person receiving help from our government that the money that they had, they were blowing it on things like that instead of buying the essentials like what I was trying to do. And so I can understand Ben Sears and Kobe's frustration of why do we only have this much money? And then he goes on to talk about, he says, "Consider also our sons," Ben Sears continued. "Are they not following in the footsteps of their fathers? Need they and their families and their sons' families live all their lives in the midst of such treasures of gold? And yet, like us, be content to banquet upon sour goat's milk and porridge." When you look at society, and you look at entitlements, and you look at the problems that way, are we creating a situation where it's going to become generational? Where people become content to live off the government, and yet their children learn to do it, and children learn to do it, and children learn to do it. Right after the levees broke in New Orleans, I flew down there for a conference. And I remember I just was appalled at the sorry state of the city. Last year I went back and it's completely different again. It's the New Orleans like it was before, beautiful, and it's being revived and cleaned up, and shops are coming back and businesses are opening again. But the year after, I was sad for the population. I was worried for the continued growth of the city of New Orleans. And on the flight back, I sat next to an older lady. She was probably in her mid-70s, and said she was born and raised in New Orleans, as she put it. She talked about the beignets and the gumbo and everything like that. And we talked about, I went and visited, a lot of the graves and cemeteries and a lot of the neat architecture and Jefferson Square and things like that. Well, I asked her, I said, I noticed that just the sheer amount of people just roaming the streets in tattered clothes and the filth and the problems. And I said, what's going on? I mean, obviously the levee's broke. I understand that. And she said it's generational. They're just waiting for the government to give them a check. And they said their parents got it, their grandparents got it. And so what is it inside of us as children of our Heavenly Father that one day stops? Because I believe that we all have a desire to become greater. It's an inherent tribute in every single human being, every single child of God, to become better than what they are, to rise above the circumstances they were born in, whether that be the poorest of men or the richest of men. The desire to constantly do good and become better is what you're born with. But life changes that. So in this book, in the first chapter, we're going to read about that. As you go along even further, they talk about, you know what? He passed his friend Arcad, riding in his golden chariot. And so he got a little jealous there, right? Kobe goes on, or Banzir says, he's claimed to be the richest man in all of Babylon. Kobe replies, so rich the king is said to seek his golden aid in affairs of the treasury. And then Banzir states, so rich, I fear if I should meet him in the darkness of the night, I would lay my hands upon his fat wallet. And then Kobe actually says something that's brilliant. He says, nonsense, reproved Kobe. A man's wealth is not in the purse he carries. A fat purse quickly empties if there be no golden stream to refill it. Arcad has an income that constantly keeps his purse full, no matter how liberally he spends it. Income, that is the thing, said Banzir. That is the thing that this entire course we've been trying to teach you. Income is a crucial thing. It is the wisdom that a man and woman holds that makes them rich, not the amount of dollars in their pocket or their wallet or their bank account. Because with wisdom comes money. But money does not create wise men. Now you can use money to go to college. You can use money to do classes. But a wise man attends the college and learns. A wise woman and man uses that money to continue their education. So take that to heart as you're reading this chapter and going through. It's not the amount of money in your wallet that makes you wise or rich. It's the wiseness in your brain, right? It's the amount of knowledge you have. Because as you go through, if you continue learning, that is how you're going to become wealthy and fatten thy purse. When I was a waiter, I think I've told you guys that, right across from University Mall, and I had a friend of mine who would come in and visit and eat there on a regular basis. He had a daughter a couple years younger than me, was attending college, just starting out, and I'd talk about books and classes. And one day, he pulled me aside next to his table, he and his wife. And he looks me in the eyes and says, John? Yeah? I responded. He said, you are going to do great things in this life. I said, well, thank you. He kind of smiled at me and he says, you know how I know? And I said, I'd love to hear it. And he says, I've watched you over the course of the many times I've come in this restaurant. I've noticed that those who are professional and successful, you go to their tables and you ask them questions and you listen. He says, not many people know how to do that. You're not trying to tell them how great you are. You're asking them and you're learning from them and you're taking those things, aren't you? And I smiled, and inside I was very elated because I thought, wow, that is what I'm doing. And I was proud to see that someone else had recognized it because I consider this individual a very, very wise man. And then he shared some of his wisdom with me of how he got to where he was and what he did. And I knew that I was doing that job to pay my bills. I was doing that job to ensure for my wife and future children, but that wasn't my career. And that's the one thing that I want to impart with everyone here. Banzir and Kobe, when they realized their problem, and in the chapter it talks about that, I've never heard you talk this way before. And he said, and his response is, I've never thought this way before. I'm doing all this work for all these rich men, and yet I'm not getting rich. So once you have that aha moment, when the light turns on, then you need to go and seek out those who are the professionals. Just like Kobe and Bansier, they decided, we have a friend who's done it, who's been successful. Let's go and talk to him and see what we can do. Enjoy reading the first chapter.